Hi, I'm Dave DeWitt, and today I'd like to say a few things about Christians gathering together in small groups. What does the Bible say about the size of the groups we gather together? I'll make the case that there's something valuable about the church gathering in small groups. Actually, the New Testament church, the believers saved through the ministry of the apostles, never met in large groups. The assembly of the church was always in a small group. The only recorded church assemblies were in homes, and homes were small. All churches were house churches, and here's a few examples. Acts 2:46, this is very early on in Jerusalem, were breaking bread from house to house. They were taking their meals together with gladness. Chapter 5:42 of Acts, from house to house, talking about the apostles, kept right on teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ. Acts 20:20, Paul reminds the Ephesian elders, I did not shrink from declaring to you anything that was profitable and teaching publicly and from house to house. In Romans 16:3-5, Paul wrote, Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who for my sake risked their own necks, to whom not only do I give my thanks, but all the churches of the Gentiles greet the church in their house. So apparently Priscilla and Aquila had a church that met in their house in Rome. In 1 Corinthians 16:19, Paul wrote this, Aquila and Priscilla greet you with the church that's in their house. So apparently Priscilla and Aquila had a church that met in their house in Rome, and when the Jews were forced out of Rome, they moved to Corinth, where they may have gathered another church together in their home. At least the church in Corinth knew who they were. Then they apparently moved to Ephesus and again opened their home for a gathering of believers, because Paul sends to Corinth greetings from the church that met in the home of Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus. In Colossians 4:15, Paul says, greet the brethren who are in Laodicea, and also Nymphaea and the church that meets in her house. Philippians 1:2, Paul wrote to Philemon, our brother and fellow worker, also to Apphia, our sister, and to Agrippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. So it's clear, three things are clear. One, the New Testament church never gathered in a large auditorium type of meeting. Number two, they had their assemblies in homes. And number three, homes were always small. So we can conclude that the gathering of the church of the New Testament, the gatherings were always small. And everybody who reads the New Testament understands that. So people who support big churches have offered the following arguments. I'm going to give you 5 arguments offered in support of large churches with my answer to each. All right, so number 1, yeah, but what about Jesus fed the 5,000 and 4,000 and Peter spoke to over 3,000? My answer, those were unscheduled gatherings of crowds that spontaneously came together. They were not gatherings of the church. People gathered around Jesus for healing and teaching. Peter spoke to the crowd that experienced the miracles at the day of Pentecost, and again to those who gathered around the healing of the lame man at the temple. But there was no example or command for believers to gather together in a meeting of the church in a large group. Practically speaking, occasional large group meetings might be advantageous for evangelism or distributing goods to the poor or needy, but huge crowds gathered around Jesus because he healed everybody who came to him. Paul spoke to large groups of unbelievers in Athens, but no regular assembly of the church was scheduled, planned, or organized as a large meeting. Second, a second common argument given for a megachurch people is sort of like, yeah, but what about persecution? Maybe they couldn't build a large church due to persecution. Well, my answer is the apostles never held back from doing what was right, what the right thing to do was, or the best thing to do because of persecution. The apostles never suggested bigger was better for a church gathering, or that it would be better to have a large group. For three, objection, yeah, but an example is not a command. The apostles did not command small groups. Since the apostles did not specify a form of a church, we're free to adapt whatever style works best. My answer is the idea that what's good is what works is pragmatism is not a good test for truth. Also, it's true that examples are not commands, but they're given for a reason. The form forms the impact. Or as Marshall McLuhan used to say, the medium is the message. If you change the way the message is presented, you also change the message. If I go to hear symphony orchestra, I do not expect to learn to play the violin. I go as a spectator to be entertained with no thought of involvement. And the bigger the audience, the better. It's best if all the seats in the auditorium are filled. But entertainment is not what the apostles had in mind. Small groups encourage participation, thinking, and reasoning. Another objection, a fourth one, yeah, but small groups are easily taken over by false teaching. My answer, really? And large groups aren't? Nearly every significant false teaching in the church is linked to some megachurch pastor. The preaching in small groups is usually the most biblical, and it encourages participation, which is the best check on false teaching. A fifth objection, yeah, but large churches often encourage breaking up into small groups during the week, midweek small groups. My answer is small groups themselves are not what the apostles formed. Let's think about it a bit. Hebrews 10:25 includes the command not forsaking our own assembly together. The words I'd like you to notice are our own, or the King James says of ourselves. Believers who only gather in mixed groups are not gathering themselves together. As believers, we're to gather ourselves together. We're not to build or rent an auditorium, schools, restaurants, mall, or some mega facility and invite in everyone who will come. That's okay if you're having an evangelistic rally for a few days, but it's not an assembly of the church. The church is when believers who know each other from their various networks of fellowship find a way to gather themselves together in groups small enough to fit into a house. When we call for gatherings of auditorium-sized places and encourage seekers to come, then we have a mixed group, not a gathering of the church. Of course, we can't teach them much because they won't understand much. When that large group is divided up into small groups, we do not have the believers gathering themselves together. We have a mixture of small groups, which is usually allowing shallow and superficial characteristics by sharing ignorance. So the assembly of the church is not just to be small, it's to be a gathering of believers, not subdividing large groups into small groups for the sake of having small groups. In conclusion, we can say that with confidence that the gatherings of the first century were in groups small enough to meet in someone's home. Whatever the immediate reason for it, the apostles never suggested something different would be better. The small group generated a discussion rather than a sermon, which led to growth and ministry not available in a large group setting. Well, thanks for listening. My paper on small groups is available on our website, relationalconcepts.org.